I remember the cicadas most of all. Their shrill chorus stitched itself into the heat, so loud it felt like the air was trembling. The August sun pressed against the sliding paper doors, turning the edges of the shoji a warm, tired gold. I was ladling miso soup into a shallow bowl, steam curling in slow ribbons, when I noticed how still the street outside had become. Our shop had been open for barely an hour. The shelves smelled faintly of pickled daikon and rice bran, and the tatami mats were warm where the morning sun touched them. My wife was in the back, rolling damp laundry into neat bundles to take to the line. A neighbor's child trotted past the open door, sandals slapping against the dirt, a string of bright paper fish trailing from his hand. I stepped outside, letting my eyes adjust to the brightness. The street was the same one I had walked for 30 years, narrow, edged by wooden shopfronts and tiled eaves that sagged a little more each summer. Mrs. Tanaka was sweeping her front step, her broom whispering against the wood. Across the street, old Mr. Kuroda sat on his stool, polishing his glasses with a square of linen, as he always did before opening his little stationery store. Life had been thin these past years. Rice rations barely filled a palm, sugar was a memory, and silk kimonos had long been traded or stored away. But Hiroshima was still whole. The war had taken so much from the country, yet our city seemed untouched, almost forgotten. We were a military hub, yes, but not a target, people said. There was something comforting in that belief, like an amulet we all carried in our pockets. A train's horn drifted in from the direction of the station. Long and low, I could smell the faint tang of the river, heavy with summer mud. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, twice, and then fell silent. I went back inside to fetch the laundry for my wife. The fabric was damp and cool in my hands, smelling faintly of soap made from ash. She took it from me without a word, her eyes on the courtyard where a single dragonfly hovered in place, its wings catching the light. "Strange morning," she murmured. I asked her why, but she only shook her head. I noticed then that the sunlight seemed sharper somehow, whiter. It pooled in strange shapes across the floorboards, as if the air itself was bending. Back on the street, I heard Mr. Kuroda say something to Mrs. Tanaka in a low voice. They glanced upward together, toward a pale smudge in the far blue sky. It might have been a cloud. It might have been something else. A young delivery boy hurried past on his bicycle, his bell ringing twice. His face was flushed, but not from the heat. Behind him, the laundry lines in the alley swayed, though I felt no wind. I remember glancing at the clock. Just after 8. The cicadas were still screaming. The sun was still pouring through the paper doors. And yet, there was a tightness in the air, like the moment before rain, when the sky decides what it will do. My wife stepped out to hang the first bundle of laundry. I reached for a broom to sweep the front of the shop. The bristles had just touched the ground when I felt it. A pause, as though the whole city had drawn in a single breath. Even the cicadas fell silent. And then the pause stretched. It wasn't long, perhaps the length of one heartbeat, 2. Yet it felt as if the world had balanced on the edge of something unseen. Then the sounds of the street returned, thin and hesitant. A child laughed somewhere behind the row of shops. Mrs. Tanaka resumed sweeping, though her strokes were slower. A bicycle bell chimed again, far away this time, its echo oddly flat against the morning air. I tilted my head upward. The pale smudge in the sky was still there. It had grown sharper in outline, and for a moment I thought I saw the glint of metal, catching and vanishing as it turned. My wife, still holding the damp clothespin between her fingers, followed my gaze. "It's too high," she said, almost to herself. "Too high." for us to hear the engines. Her voice had that same low murmur as when she spoke of a relative's illness. Careful, restrained, unwilling to let fear slip free. I had heard that tone before, in the tea shops where women whispered about the bombings of Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. A single army truck rumbled past at the far end of the street. The driver did not look left or right. Behind him, 2 soldiers sat stiffly on the wooden bench, their rifles across their knees. The sight of them in full daylight was uncommon here. Hiroshima's barracks were toward the outskirts, and the soldiers usually kept to their own quarters, unless on parade. The delivery boy reappeared, coasting downhill with his head bent low, the paper parcels in his basket shifting with each bump. He didn't look up when he passed. I thought I heard him mutter something, perhaps about the sky, but the words were lost in the cicadas' resumed chorus. I stepped back inside the shop and found myself glancing at the framed family photograph on the wall. My son, in his school uniform, his hair neat under the cap. My daughter, in her cotton summer kimono patterned with morning glories. They were both at their schools that morning. The thought came and went like a bird's shadow, quick, light, and gone before I could hold on to it. A thin whistle reached my ears. Not the sharp, falling kind of an air raid siren, but a natural sound. Wind moving through a narrow space. Perhaps only there was no wind. I set down the broom and went to the doorway again. The street had taken on a different quality. People moved with the same familiar gestures, lifting crates, chatting, walking with baskets. But their eyes flicked upward more often now. The sky was an unbroken blue, except for that one smudge, silver edge shifting almost imperceptibly. From somewhere beyond the rooftops came the distant clatter of a handcart hitting a stone. A dog barked and would not stop, the sound bouncing between the wooden walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. I crossed the street to where Mr. Kuroda stood. He had abandoned his stool and was squinting upward, one hand shading his eyes. "Perhaps it's one of ours," I offered. He shook his head without looking at me. "Too high for ours." Before I could reply, a shadow swept across us. Just a passing cloud, small and fleeting, but it made both of us glance around as though expecting something to have changed. The soldiers in the truck were gone. In their place, an empty stretch of road shimmered in the heat. My wife called from the doorway, "Come in, it's too hot." Her voice trembled ever so slightly. I obeyed, but lingered near the entrance, leaning against the wooden frame. The cicadas were relentless now, their chorus a wall of sound pressing against the city. The air seemed thicker, as if the heat had gained weight. Somewhere, a radio crackled to life, a burst of static, a man's voice reading something official and brief. Then, silence again. The lack of the usual music or chatter felt wrong, like an unfinished sentence. A customer entered. Young woman in a faded blouse, her hair pinned high. She asked for rice crackers, but her eyes kept sliding toward the street. She clutched her change a moment too long before lifting it into her purse. When she left, I watched her join a small knot of people, gathered at the corner, all looking in the same direction, toward the center of the sky. I had the sudden, unreasonable thought that the city itself was waiting for something. Not in fear exactly, but in a state of taut expectation, like a bowstring drawn back and held. My wife had gone quiet in the back room. The only sound from there was the gentle snap of cloth on the line as she hung the laundry. The sunlight had shifted again, brighter still, as though the day had skipped forward without warning. I felt a prickling on the back of my neck. Somewhere deep inside, I knew, without knowing how, that the pause from earlier had not been the last. Another was coming, and this time it would not pass so easily. I turned toward the street, squinting against the glare. The smudge in the sky had vanished, And then, from the corner of my vision, something white flared. Too bright to be the sun, too quick to be a cloud. The white light was not like sunlight. It had a purity to it, a whiteness so clean it seemed to erase color itself. It filled the edges of my sight, burning through the wooden frame of the shop front, through the cloth of my lids. For an instant, I thought the world had turned to paper, and someone had held it up to a flame. I don't remember deciding to close my eyes. My body did it for me, but the brightness still pressed against the lids, a red-orange pulse that felt alive. Heat followed it, not the slow wait August, but a sudden, fierce rush, as if an open furnace had been thrust against my skin. Then came the sound. It wasn't like thunder. Thunder rolls, fades, returns. This was a single enormous crack, sharp and deep at the same time, as though the sky had broken in two. It struck the chest before it struck the ears, a blow that sent the air from my lungs and replaced it with dust. I stumbled backward, my hands groping for the doorway, finding only emptiness. The floor beneath my feet shuddered, the tatami mats shifting like the surface of a wave. Shelves groaned. Glass, I didn't know from where, shattered into a rain of clear knives. The heat kept growing, even as the light faded from behind my eyes. I smelled burning cloth before I felt it. The faint singe of my sleeve where a spark had landed. Somewhere nearby, something else was burning. Not wood, not paper, a smell thick and strange, like hair caught in flame. I tried to call for my wife, but found my mouth full of grit. The taste was metallic, bitter, as if the air itself had turned to rust. The next moments are broken, scattered in my mind like fragments of porcelain. My wife's shape in the courtyard, her hands covering her head. The laundry whipping from the line, flung into the air as if by an invisible hand. A sudden, impossible wind rushing through the shop, tearing at everything that wasn't nailed down. I think I fell. My hands hit the floor first, stinging from the tatami fibers. My forehead struck something hard, and for a second I saw nothing but black, as if the world had been snuffed out. When I opened my eyes, the air was dim. Not night, but a strange reddish twilight. The light came from everywhere and nowhere, as if the sun had been dissolved into dust. Shapes moved within it, hunched, stumbling figures I could barely recognize as neighbors. The cicadas were gone. The only sound was a faint continuous ringing inside my ears, like a bell struck once, long ago. Still trembling, I pushed myself upright, my palms leaving dark prints in the dust. The shop around me was no longer a shop. The front wall had vanished. The shelves lay on their sides, their contents spilled and unrecognizable. The photograph on the wall was gone. My first thought was my wife. I turned toward the courtyard. What had been the courtyard, and saw nothing but a heap of roof tiles and splintered beams. I shouted her name, but the sound was swallowed before it left my lips. I tried again and again, my throat raw, until I tasted blood. I took one step forward, then another, and the world tilted. A board gave way beneath me, and I dropped to my knees, my hands sinking into something warm. When I looked down, my fingers were reeked with soot and something darker. There was movement ahead, a shadow limping between the ruins. I called out, and the figure turned its head. The face was half covered in ash, the eyes wide but unfocused. The mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no sound came. They moved past me without recognition, without slowing. The heat was still there, a constant pressure on the skin. I could feel it radiating from the ground itself. Ash floated through the air like snow, settling on my hair, my shoulders, my lashes. The dust in my throat made me cough, each one sharper than the last, until I had to bend forward, clutching my ribs. I wanted water, but the thought of finding it seemed as distant as the thought of finding the river. Somewhere behind me, something collapsed. A roof beam, perhaps, with a dull final thud. The sound broke through the ringing for an instant, only to fade again into that suffocating silence. I knew I should move. I knew that standing still in this place was as dangerous as the moment that had just passed. But my feet would not obey. My mind was caught in the gap between before and after, unable to believe they were part of the same day, the same hour, the same breath. It was then I realized I could no longer hear the living city. No footsteps on wooden boards, no bicycle bells, no shopkeepers calling prices, only the silence. And I feared it more than the light. The silence was not empty. It had weight, as if the air itself had thickened, pressing down on the skin, seeping into the lungs. Every movement felt slower, heavier, as though the city had sunk underwater. I stepped over the collapsed beam, my legs trembling. The ground was uneven now. Brick, tile, and wood splintered into a single shifting surface. My sandals scraped against the debris, sending small avalanches of dust down into hollows where rooms had once been. The street outside the shop no longer existed as I knew it. The row of wooden fronts was gone, replaced by a jagged expanse of rubble. Roof tiles lay in neat stacks where they had fallen. Others were broken into knife-sharp shards. Smoke rose from half-buried fires, curling in thin, stubborn threads. I moved toward where Mrs. Tanaka's shop had been. In its place was an open scar of earth, the wooden walls nowhere to be seen. A single broom, hers, lay on the ground, bristles blackened, the handle warped like soft clay. Beyond, shapes moved in the haze. At first I thought they were drifting pieces of cloth, caught on the wind, but they stumbled, reached out with hands, clutched at the air. People. Some were bare to the waist, their clothes torn away. Others wore garments burned into their skin. Faces were swollen, hair singed, eyes staring without focus. A man passed close by me, holding his arms out in front of him as if cradling something invisible. His hands were dark, the skin peeling in sheets. I wanted to speak, to ask who he was, but my mouth was dry and my throat raw from the dust. When I tried to call out, only a whisper came. The station should have been close, just a short walk from here. But every landmark was gone. The familiar shop signs, the narrow alleys, even the curve of the road had vanished under layers of ash and splintered wood. I found myself turning in slow circles, searching for some point of recognition. In the distance, a low moan began. Not a single voice, but many, rising and falling like the wind through reeds. It came from every direction, from behind collapsed walls, from under shattered beams. I passed what had once been the stationery shop. The stool where Mr. Kuroda polished his glasses was gone, the doorway filled with broken beams and dust. I told myself he might have been away from the shop when it happened, though the thought rang hollow in my head. The sky was no longer blue. A dull, orange-brown light filtered down through a haze of smoke and drifting ash. The sun itself was only a faint disk, as if seen through oiled paper. The air smelled of burning tatami mats, wet earth, and something acrid I did not want to name. At the corner where the army truck had passed earlier, I found the twisted frame of its wheels. The wooden bed was gone. No sign of the driver or the soldiers. My feet took me toward the river. I did not think about it. The body moves on its own when the mind is stunned. The ground sloped gently downward, and soon I heard the faint rush of water. It was the first sound that did not belong to the disaster, and I almost quickened my pace toward it. But when I reached the bank, I stopped. The river was filled not only with water, but with the dark, shifting forms of people. Some moving weakly, some floating still, others knelt at the edge, scooping water into their hands and pressing it to burned skin. The current carried pieces of wood, a single sandal, fragments of cloth. A woman crouched near me, her face turned away. She rocked back and forth, humming a sound that was not quite a song. In her lap lay a small bundle wrapped in cloth. I knew without asking that the bundle would not move. I turned away, my chest tight, and looked back toward the heart of the city. The haze shifted, revealing the outline of the distant hills, black against the strange light. It struck me then how far the devastation seemed to reach. This was not a fire in one neighborhood. This was everywhere. The ringing in my ears had faded enough. Now that I could hear small things, the creak of a beam settling, the crunch of debris underfoot, the ragged breaths of those who still moved. But the rhythm of the city, the voices, the carts, the vendors was gone entirely. In its place was this new sound, the slow, broken noise of a place learning how to die. I stood there for what could have been minutes or hours. The heat on my skin did not lessen. The dust in the air did not settle. Somewhere behind me, a man began to cough, deep and what? Somewhere ahead, a beam cracked and fell. I knew I could not stay by the river forever. There were people to find, my wife, my children, and yet, I felt rooted to the spot, as though leaving would mean admitting that everything I knew of Hiroshima had ended. It was not the blast that told me my city was gone. It was this silence. The days that followed bled together, one into the next, without the familiar bells of the streetcars or the chatter of the morning market to mark their passing. Morning and evening were the same muted color, a gray-brown twilight that clung to the sky. I slept little. When I did, I woke to the same smell of dust and smoke, the same ache in my chest from the air I had breathed. The tatami in the shop had been buried under rubble, so I lay on a patch of earth cleared of debris, using a bundle of cloth as a pillow. I found my wife on the second day, or rather, she found me. Her hair was matted with ash, her hands raw and blistered, but her eyes were clear. She had been in the alley. The shop, when the light came, shielded for a moment by the narrow walls. We didn't speak much. Our words were short, functional, as though speech itself had to be rationed. She told me she had seen no sign of our children yet. Each day, I walked what remained of our streets. They were not streets anymore, only corridors through wreckage. I learned to step carefully, for the ground hid holes where cellars had collapsed, and beams still shifted underfoot. Some corners were marked by small piles of belongings. A pot, a sandal, a teacup gathered neatly as if the owner might come back for them. By the river, people still knelt to drink. The water was warm now, carrying the smell of char and metal. Pieces of houses floated by. A door frame, a paper lantern, the curved tile of a roof. I thought of how many New Years we had watched fireworks from these banks, and how now the air itself seemed to hold the glow of something too large to be contained. On the third morning, I stood where our street had once bent toward the station. In the distance, the hills still held their shape, dark and silent. The city between us was flat in places, jagged in others, like a broken tooth. Smoke rose here and there, thin and lazy, as if even fire had grown tired. It was then I realized the quiet was no longer as absolute as it had been. There were small sounds now, the shuffling of feet, the clink of a pot, the low murmur of voices speaking in half words. The city was not alive as it had been, but it was not entirely still either. The silence had softened, though it was still heavy. That evening, my wife and I shared a rice ball with a woman we did not know. She had found it in the pocket of a coat, and insisted we take a piece. We ate slowly, the grain sticking to our fingers, the taste almost sweet after days of dust. I thought of the meals we had complained were too small, and how they would have been feasts now. There were no lamps, no fires. We dared keep burning long, but the moon rose bright enough to cast shadows. I sat outside what remained of our shop, watching the pale light paint the rubble in silver. The stillness of the city at night was different than before. Not the peaceful sleep of a safe place, but the fragile rest of something that had survived but could not yet heal. On the 5th day, I found a shoe. It was small, made of soft blue cloth, with a worn patch near the toe. I knew it at once. It belonged to my daughter. I held it for a long time, running my thumb over the stitching, feeling the dust that had settled into its seams. I did not know whether it had been dropped in flight or left behind for me to find. I kept it, tucking it into my sleeve. The weight of it was almost nothing, yet it anchored me to the ground. Now, as I walk the ruins, I no longer look for familiar streets. The city I knew is gone. In its place is a landscape of memory and shadow, where each turn holds both the echo of what was and the quiet proof of what remains. The cicadas have returned, faintly at first, then louder each day. Their sound does not fill the air as it once did, but it slips into the silence, weaving through it like thread. And sometimes, when the sun leans low and the dust glows in the light, I can almost imagine the street before the blast. The broom in Mrs. Tanaka's hands, the boy with his paper fish, the warm smell of miso in the morning, but it is always only a moment. Then the wind shifts, and I am back in the quiet. I survived Hiroshima's silence, but it walks with me still. You've been listening to Lost Sapien. If you'd like to hear the next voice time almost forgot, subscribing will bring it to you.